Compra una batería seleccionada Superstart y recibe una tarjeta de regalo O'Reilly de hasta $15 después del reembolso. Superstart, solo en O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a topic today that honestly keeps me up at night. Disinformation.
It's certainly a timely one.
It really is. And to help us unpack all of this, we've got this interview with Ángel Gómez de Agreda.
Yes, an expert in geopolitics and cybersecurity.
And it's from the Spanish radio show, Cyber After Work. So let's jump right in. One of the things that struck me was how he sort of frames the current world, almost like we're heading toward, that classic Orwellian dystopia.
Right. He talks about this rapid pace of change and how technology and control seem to be going hand in hand.
Yeah. I mean, it's not exactly the most optimistic take, is it? But I have to say, I kind of see where he's coming from.
I think a lot of people do.
Yeah.
Especially with everything that's been happening lately.
Exactly. So where does disinformation fit into all of this?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. He makes this link between all this rapid technological advancement and the rise of disinformation. And he points specifically to artificial intelligence.
AI, of course.
Yeah. And in particular, he talks about generative AI, the kind of AI that can create content.
Right.
And he sees it as this double-edged sword. On one hand, it has amazing potential. But on the other hand, it could actually make us less intelligent.
Okay, hold on. I've heard this argument before, but I always struggle with it a bit. How can AI, something designed to process information and solve problems, actually make us dumber?
I think that's a great question. And it gets to the heart of what Gómez de Agreda is saying. You see, he argues that if we become overly reliant on AI to do our thinking for us.
Like if I just let AI summarize a whole article instead of reading it myself.
Exactly. We risk losing our ability to think critically. It's like letting a muscle atrophy because you're not using it.
I see. So it's not that AI itself is bad, it's how we use it that determines its impact on our intelligence.
Right. And he's concerned that we're not using it wisely when it comes to disinformation.
Okay, so how does this all tie back to disinformation then?
He's basically saying that AI is being weaponized in disinformation campaigns. It's not just about spreading rumors or, fake news articles anymore.
Right.
Now, malicious actors are using AI to create these incredibly sophisticated, personalized disinformation campaigns.
It's funny you say that. I've actually noticed this myself. Like, it used to be so easy to spot a phishing email.
Oh, totally.
The grammar would be all over the place.
Yeah.
Misspellings galore. Now, these scams are just getting so clever. Is that what he's talking about?
Exactly. Attackers are using AI to craft these messages that are nearly impossible to distinguish from legitimate communication.
Wow.
They can analyze your online behavior, figure out your interests and vulnerabilities, and then create messages that are specifically designed to trick you.
So AI is taking phishing from like a shotgun approach to a sniper rifle approach.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just about stealing your data anymore.
What do you mean?
Gómez de Agreda argues that disinformation has become a primary goal in a lot of these attacks.
So it's not just about tricking people into clicking on bad links. There's something bigger going on.
It's about undermining trust in institutions, sowing discord among people,
right,
and ultimately destabilizing entire societies.
It's like they're trying to hack our minds, not just our computers.
That's a powerful way to think about it.
And, he uses that example of the hospital cyber attack during the pandemic.
Yes.
It's a pretty sobering reminder of how high the stakes are.
Absolutely. Imagine a hospital already struggling with a surge of patients, and suddenly they lose access to critical systems because of a ransomware attack.
All fueled by a disinformation campaign.
The consequences could be devastating.
And it's not just hypothetical either. He mentions how similar tactics were used after the Halloween crowd crush in Seoul.
Yeah. Attackers exploited the chaos and fear in the aftermath of that tragedy to spread misinformation.
It's just awful how they prey on these moments of vulnerability. So who's behind all of this? Who are these masterminds of disinformation?
Well, Gómez de Agreda points out that there isn't just one single mastermind. There are all sorts of actors involved.
Yeah.
Some are driven by personal gain, money, power, you name it.
Right.
Others are motivated by ideology. They want to push a certain worldview or undermine opposing views.
Got it.
And then you have state actors who use disinformation as a tool of geopolitical influence.
So basically, it's a whole messy mix of motivations and players. But it sounds like what they all have in common is that they're trying to exploit our emotions, our biases.
Exactly. They understand that when we're driven by fear, anger, outrage, we're less likely to think critically and more likely to fall for manipulation.
So how do we fight back against this? What tools do we have at our disposal?
Well, Gómez de Agreda is pretty clear about his stance on censorship. He's against it.
I can see why.
He argues that it's a slippery slope. It can be just as dangerous as disinformation itself.
Yeah, I mean, who gets to decide what's true and what's not?
Exactly. So instead of censorship, he advocates for a multi-pronged approach. Transparency, education, critical thinking.
Okay, I like where he's going with this. But how do you actually promote critical thinking in a world where everyone's constantly bombarded with information from every direction?
That's where media literacy comes in.
Media literacy.
Yeah, teaching people how to evaluate sources, identify bias, discern fact from fiction.
So giving people the skills to be more discerning information consumers.
Exactly. But even with the best tools, it can still be hard to resist the emotional pull of disinformation, especially when it aligns with our existing beliefs or fears.
Oh, absolutely.
So he suggests a simple strategy. Pause.
Pause.
Yeah. Before you react to a piece of information, before you share it, take a moment. Consider the source, the potential biases, the motivations behind it.
Oh, that's actually really good advice. I'm going to try to remember that.
That's a good reminder for all of us.
Yeah.
We need to be more mindful of how we consume information and how our own biases might be coloring our perceptions.
Now, he also talks about who's really good at disinformation, right?
Right.
What makes them so effective?
Yeah, he says that the folks who are really good at this, they understand their audience. They know how to tap into our fears, exploit our prejudices, and ultimately manipulate us to get what they want.
It's almost like psychological warfare, isn't it? Using information as a weapon to influence how we think and act. And he mentions this trend that's really concerning.
Oh, yeah.
The use of disinformation to disrupt unity and trust, not just within countries, but also between allies.
Wow.
Think about the impact on global stability if we can't even trust our own partners.
That's what makes this issue so dangerous. It has the potential to undermine the foundations of our societies.
Okay, so let me just recap here for a second.
Yeah.
We've got AI making it harder to even spot disinformation.
Right.
We've got these bad actors using it to sow discord and destabilize societies.
Yes.
And a whole lot of people susceptible to its manipulation. This is starting to paint a pretty bleak picture.
Well, Gómez de Agreda doesn't stop there. To really grasp the threat, he says we need to zoom out and look at the bigger context. He argues that the world is changing faster than ever before,
Okay.
and our current systems are simply not equipped to handle it.
He actually compares it to trying to solve the three-body problem.
He does. Which, if you think about it, is a pretty complex physics problem.
Yeah.
It has to do with the difficulty of predicting the movements of three celestial bodies that are all influencing each other. There's no simple solution.
So what he's saying is that the world today is kind of like that. There are so many interconnected factors at play
Exactly.
that it's nearly impossible to predict how things will unfold.
It makes the Cold War era, with its two superpowers, seem almost straightforward.
Right.
And Gómez de Agreda's argument is that our institutions, our ways of thinking, haven't caught up to this new reality. We're trying to navigate a chaotic world with outdated tools.
So if the old ways don't work, what do we do instead? How do we chart a course in this turbulent sea?
That's where things get really interesting, and we'll dive into that in part 2.
All right, we'll be right back after a quick break.
As we're talking about all these systems and how they're struggling to keep up, one thing that really jumped out at me from Gómez de Agreda's interview was his focus on debt.
Oh, yeah.
He sees rising debt levels as this major contributor to the instability we're seeing in the world.
Debt. I hadn't really connected that to disinformation before, but I can see how it, creates vulnerability.
Absolutely. Think about it. When countries are drowning in debt, it puts immense pressure on governments to take action.
Okay.
They might make rash decisions, cut essential services, resort to extreme economic policies, all in an attempt to stabilize things.
Right.
And that can easily lead to social unrest, political instability, the perfect breeding ground for disinformation.
Oh, so it's not that debt directly causes disinformation, but it weakens a country's, I guess you could say, immune system, makes it more susceptible to these kinds of attacks.
Precisely. And it's not just internally. High debt levels can also make countries vulnerable to manipulation from outside forces.
How so?
Well, think about it. A country desperate for cash might be more willing to accept predatory loans or trade deals that ultimately benefit the lender more than the borrower.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
And that just digs the hole even deeper.
It's a vicious cycle then. Debt leads to instability. Instability makes you vulnerable. Vulnerability leads to more debt, and so on.
Exactly. And that's where disinformation becomes this incredibly powerful weapon.
Oh, yeah.
Those who want to exploit a nation's weakness, they can use disinformation to sow chaos, undermine trust in the government, and even manipulate public opinion to support policies that, well, frankly, benefit the exploiter, not the exploited.
So it's like they're using disinformation to weaken a country from the inside out, making it easier to control or influence. That's scary.
It is. But Gómez de Agreda, he doesn't leave us completely without hope.
Oh, good.
He argues that while the challenges are, massive, they're not insurmountable.
Okay, I like that.
He believes there's a path forward, but it requires us to fundamentally rethink how we approach technology and global governance.
Okay, a fundamental shift. That sounds ambitious.
It does, but it's necessary. He says we need to move beyond these outdated systems and mindsets that, were really shaped by the post-World War II era.
Right.
Those systems, they just weren't designed for the world we live in today.
You mentioned earlier that he compares this to the three-body problem.
I did, and I think it's worth unpacking that a bit more.
Yeah, I agree. What exactly does he mean by that?
So the three-body problem comes from physics. And it basically refers to the difficulty of predicting movements of three celestial bodies when they're all gravitationally influencing each other.
Okay.
There's no easy answer. Any attempt to predict where they'll go in the long term becomes incredibly complex, just because of the way all these forces interact.
So he's saying that our world today is kind of like that. There are so many interconnected factors at play that it's almost impossible to predict what's going to happen next.
Exactly. We have multiple global powers jostling for position. We have rapid technological advancements, with all sorts of unintended consequences. And a global economy so interconnected that a tiny hiccup in one place can trigger a massive earthquake somewhere else. It's a recipe for unpredictability.
It makes the Cold War seem so simple in comparison. Two superpowers, one clear enemy.
Right. But those days are gone. And Gómez de Agreda argues that we're still trying to use the same old tools and playbooks that we used back then. We're trying to navigate a chaotic world with, an outdated map.
So if the old ways of doing things don't work anymore, what does he propose? What's the alternative?
Well, he talks about the need for greater international cooperation.
Okay.
But not within the confines of these old, rigid institutions. He's calling for a more flexible, adaptable approach.
So moving away from these big bureaucratic structures and towards a more nimble, responsive network.
Exactly.
That's a pretty big ask, though. I mean, how do you achieve that kind of cooperation when there's so much mistrust between nations, especially with all this disinformation flying around?
That's where his focus on education and this idea of a more human-centered approach to technology come in.
Okay, so it's not just about restructuring these big institutions.
Right.
It's about something deeper. A shift in how we think, how we use technology, how we interact with each other.
Exactly. It's about fostering critical thinking skills. Promoting media literacy, and really emphasizing ethical considerations in how we develop and deploy new technologies.
Oh, so holding these tech companies accountable, pushing for regulations that prioritize human well-being, and supporting technologies that actually help us, instead of exploiting us.
Exactly. And this isn't something that governments or institutions can do alone.
Right.
It requires a collective effort. We need to have these conversations. Support organizations pushing for a more ethical tech landscape. Vote for leaders who get it.
It's about recognizing that we're not just passive consumers of technology. We're citizens with a responsibility to shape this digital world that we're all living in.
And that technology at its core is a reflection of us, our values, our choices.
If we want a more human-centered technology, then we need to become more human-centered ourselves.
I love that.
That's a powerful idea. It's a call to action, isn't it? To be more mindful, more intentional, more engaged.
It really is.
And more compassionate, both in how we interact with technology and with each other.
It's about reclaiming our agency in a world that increasingly feels like it's spiraling out of control.
Right. Now, on a less optimistic note, what happens if we don't do all this?
Well, Gómez de Agreda, he paints a pretty stark picture of what that future might look like.
Okay.
He warns that if we stay on this current path, if we allow disinformation to keep spreading unchecked, things are going to get worse.
In what way?
We could see increased fragmentation, instability, conflict. He suggests that the world could splinter into these isolated echo chambers fueled by suspicion and paranoia.
A world where cooperation becomes impossible. Everyone's just out for themselves.
Exactly, a zero-sum mentality. But the good news is, it doesn't have to be that way.
There's still hope.
There is. He reminds us that we have a choice. We can choose to continue down this path of division and discord.
Right.
Or we can choose a different path, one that prioritizes cooperation, understanding, and a more human-centered approach to technology.
Okay, so we have a choice. But how do we actually make that choice? What concrete steps can we take, both individually and collectively, to nudge ourselves towards that better future? We'll explore that and more when we return for part 3.
Okay, so we're back. And as we wrap up this conversation about disinformation, I have to say it's a lot to take in. We've talked about AI, debt, the erosion of trust. It can feel, honestly, a bit overwhelming.
I get that. The challenges are significant. But, what I appreciate about Gómez de Agreda is that he doesn't just leave us with a sense of doom and gloom. He offers a way forward. He talks about this human-centered approach to technology. But what does that actually mean, practically speaking? Right, because it's one thing to say human-centered technology. It's another to, actually live it.
Totally. And he suggests we start by looking inward. Like, on an individual level, how can we be more aware of our own relationship with technology?
Okay.
Are we in control? Or is technology controlling us?
So it's about being more mindful, more intentional about how we use our devices, our apps.
Exactly. It's about using technology to enhance our lives, to connect with others in meaningful ways, not to just, isolate ourselves or fuel division.
It's funny. I think about how much time I spend just scrolling through social media. It's almost like I'm on autopilot.
Yeah.
Just consuming information passively, reacting emotionally, and honestly, who knows, maybe even contributing to the spread of disinformation without even realizing it.
And that's the opposite of a human-centered approach.
It's like we've handed over control to these algorithms. They determine what we see, how we think, how we feel.
Right. And Gómez de Agreda's message is about reclaiming that control, making conscious choices about how we use technology.
Aligning it with our values.
Yes, our values and our goals.
Yeah.
But it's not just about individual actions, right? There's a systemic aspect to this as well.
Okay, what do you mean?
We need to be advocating for changes in how technology is developed, how it's deployed.
So holding those big tech companies accountable.
Yes.
Pushing for regulations that prioritize people over profits.
Right. And supporting the creation of technologies that actually serve humanity, not exploit it.
But that requires collective action, doesn't it?
It does. We need to be having these conversations, supporting organizations that are fighting for change, voting for leaders who actually understand the importance of this stuff.
It's about recognizing that we're not just passive consumers of technology. We're citizens. We have a voice.
Exactly. We have a responsibility to shape the digital world that we want to live in.
And, ultimately, technology is a reflection of us, isn't it?
I think so. Our values, our choices.
If we want a more human-centered technology, we need to be more human-centered ourselves.
That's such a good point.
So this is a call to action then, isn't it?
I think it is.
Be more mindful, more intentional, more engaged.
And more compassionate.
Yeah. More compassionate in how we use technology and how we interact with each other.
And it's interesting. Gómez de Agreda ends his interview on this really hopeful note.
Does he?
He says, look, yes, there are a lot of challenges, but we can't give in to despair. We need to tap into our shared humanity.
Okay.
Our capacity for cooperation, and our collective wisdom. He even gives this really heartwarming example.
What's that?
He talks about how the cybersecurity community came together to help the victims of that recent natural disaster in Spain.
Oh, right.
And it's just this beautiful reminder that even amidst all the negativity, all the division, there's still this incredible amount of compassion in the world.
Yeah.
This willingness to help each other.
It's a reminder that we're not alone in this. There are people everywhere who are working towards a better future.
People who haven't given up hope.
Right. And who still believe in the power of human connection.
And that's ultimately what gives me hope. This belief that despite all the challenges, our shared humanity will prevail.
That's a powerful message. So as we wrap up this deep dive into disinformation, let's try to remember that we have a choice. We can choose to be overwhelmed by the negativity.
Yeah.
Or we can choose to be inspired by the possibilities. We can choose to be passive consumers.
Or active participants.
Yes. Active participants in shaping a more human-centered future.
That's it.
We can let fear and division rule the day, or we can embrace hope, connection, believe in our ability to create a better world.
All comes down to choice.
It does. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some food for thought, maybe even inspired you to take action. Keep thinking critically, keep questioning, and as always, keep diving deep.
Compra una batería seleccionada Superstart y recibe una tarjeta de regalo O'Reilly de hasta $15 después del reembolso. Superstart, solo en O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Oh, 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 O'Reilly Auto Parts.